Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/KYHistoryPod. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and I'm joined again here by Barry Duvall, and we're going to talk some more Muhlenberg County Civil War history. How you doing, Barry?
I'm doing okay. Thank you for having me again.
Well, we've got back together here. We're going to finish up some more about the book you wrote about the Civil War in Muhlenberg County, and we're going to get into that as much as we can. But eventually, hopefully, we can have some more episodes just of Muhlenberg County and all that, because there's more that happens in history than the Civil War. So there's plenty for us to talk about. But again, we discussed a lot last time about the generals and slavery, and how Muhlenberg was kind of divided and stuff like that. But we're gonna just keep on going, kind of with some more just I guess questions that I kind of, as I read the book or went through it, and stuff is that in that sense. But so let's talk about the Confederates in Greenville.
Well, as far as the Confederate representation in Greenville or Muhlenberg County, it's kind of interesting because it was like a 8-2 or 7.5 to 2.5 split. Weighted heavily toward the Union or federal sentiments throughout the war. But we did have a significant Confederate representation. Their records are a little harder to find. They didn't keep, the record keeping wasn't as good, and of course, being if you will, the losers in the end of the war, a lot of their records were lost. Thank goodness that some of them were kept, and we still can find references. A lot of the references to the Confederate representation in Muhlenberg County comes from obituaries, family stories, family histories, and then of course there are some military records that we can glean from as well. So we didn't have any companies of soldiers formed in Muhlenberg County for the Confederate Army. The closest thing we had to it, there were a couple of pieces. One, when Jack Thompson came from Owensboro on a recruiting mission, he picked up some of the Muhlenberg Countyans over around South Carrollton with him. The biggest piece, I think, was when Dr. Pendleton left Hartford on a recruiting mission. He came from Hartford, went over to South Carrollton, recruited, ended up in Greenville, and that was about September 1861. And he was packing them in pretty heavily. So what he ended up doing there, when he arrived in Greenville, they knew he was coming. Sheriff Moses Wycliffe had actually quit his position as sheriff with the intent of joining up with Pendleton. And he did, along with 20 other young men. There were some fellas all along the road. There were some that came from Paradise to join up, and they really didn't muster in until they got to Russellville. Like I said, since the company wasn't formed in Muhlenberg County, they took everybody that was interested, said, "Come along with us. This is what we're going to do," and they headed south along the old road to Russellville out of Greenville. A lot of the Muhlenberg County representation with the Confederacy can be found in Company C of the 9th Kentucky Infantry. You'll also find early on, that was the 5th Kentucky Confederate Infantry, but they changed it to the 9th due to, I think there was some conflict over, who's the 5th and who's going to be the 9th. But by the shortly after they got to Russellville, they established themselves as the 9th. I'm pretty sure is when that happened. But anyhow, we had a pretty good representation, not as strong as the Union group. We also had some outliers, which we can talk about, which would be like Colonel Bob Martin. He was a heavy hitter throughout the war, and I think we're going to discuss him some here in a minute. And then representation in that group under John Hunt Morgan. Helms regiment. I think that was pretty big. That was the 1st Kentucky, 10th Kentucky. I'm looking here at my notes. General Helm, but we had representation. One of my stories about the Confederates that I always tell people is they were young guys, most of them. The Confederates that joined up were generally a younger age group than the Union soldiers. For some reason, the demographics lay out that way. There was a young man by the name of George Vickers from Paradise. He and his brother Henry had joined up with Dr. Pendleton when he came through, and they were en route to Russellville. And George, I think he was about 15 years old, was packing an old, outdated shotgun, but they were going off to war. Whatever they had, they were going to try to move themselves. They had marched and probably had even camped at least once before this happened, but they were down around what we call Myers Chapel. There's a church down there now. It's been slightly moved from where it was then, and they had stopped to take a break. They're sitting down, probably eating apples, whatever they could. September, they're probably getting some apples and stuff. When they got ready to resume the march, George stands up and he knocks his shotgun over and it fires.
Oh.
Shot himself in the head. He was dead.
Gosh.
About 15 years old, George Vickers, and it was kind of a shocking scene to all these young fellas. A friend of theirs marching off to war, and sadly seeing that moment of death, it must have been a great shock to all of them, but it was far from the last that they would see. They were going to witness a whole lot of shocking scenes in the days and years to come. But I never could find the grave of George Vickers. He was from Paradise. I figure he was either buried there locally and then maybe exhumed and carried back. It was a bit far. I don't know what happened to his body. It's such a sad story.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That is pretty shocking, but very true. As in they you would almost think they would turn around and say, "That's it. We won't. We've seen enough." But they were definitely going to see some more by sticking around.
It was an interesting situation. And then the sentiments throughout the war, I want to mention this too. We had at least 5 that I was able to confirm that left the Union Army and went to the Confederate Army. It's been discussed whether or not they were looking for the bounty. Most of that happened after 1863. With the Emancipation Proclamation, which did not affect the slavery situation in the state of Kentucky, the people were still somewhat confused, even though they weren't. Muhlenberg wasn't a big slaveholding area, but they were confused. Rother, one of the historians I refer back to, said that the sentiment was somewhat alienated. They were no fans of Lincoln in Muhlenberg County. He didn't carry Muhlenberg County in either election. But in 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation, you find a whole lot of people was kind of sick of the war and the politics of it. Try not to
especially in Kentucky.
Yeah. Yeah. In Kentucky, had a star on both flags, so why not? If I don't want to fight here, I'll go fight the other side. But it's an odd thought to think that you're shooting at that group, and the next day you go over and join them, shoot back at the group you were with.
Yeah. So John C. Breckenridge, he also comes to Muhlenberg County, which again, pretty big a name when it comes to the Civil War, a vice president, and all those things.
Yeah.
Kentuckian as well. What was his doings? Why would he come to Muhlenberg County?
Well, after he was vice president, and then he ran on the presidential ticket for 1860, and he carried the vote pretty much, in our area tremendously, was supported. And then after losing the election, he became a senator in in that, the next 2-year term, I suppose. Anyhow, so he's was there, but he was getting so ridiculed over his stance. He was trying to figure a peaceful solution instead of all-out war to address the issue of slavery. And he was kind of persecuted in the Senate and became very uneasy, unhappy. And when he was offered a position with the Confederate Army, he took it. He just ran with it. And so Breckenridge then took command of the 1st Kentucky Brigade in November 1861. And the troop movements then, Kentucky was always heavily occupied, busy with troop movements. I don't think people realize how heavily they did move through the state, because like we discussed before, it wasn't a line. We call it a line, north-south. It's not on. If it is, it's a big fuzzy line. And there's a whole lot of infringement between both armies throughout Kentucky, and a whole lot of activities in Russellville, Hopkinsville, and Bowling Green, of course, which was a big occupation of the Confederate Army there. And so Breckenridge, one of the first things that he had done, may have been recruiting. I don't really know what he was doing, but he had been to Hopkinsville. And just the route from east to west to go through, from the east, you would come through Skylesville, Rochester, come down, you'd come through Greenville and head on down toward Hopkinsville. And so he made some passes through there, which was something that I discovered and I found quite interesting, because there's little or no mention of it in any of the records. You'll find a newspaper clipping of it, though, in Hopkinsville or Owensboro that'll say that General Breckenridge moved 2,000 troops through the county seat of Muhlenberg, which is Greenville, on such and such date. And I'm like, wow, local historians haven't talked about this. So, but and keep in mind, he's recruiting too. I mean, as he comes through, he's picking up Muhlenberg County soldiers. There was quite a few that just grabbed a hold and moved with them. There was a fellow by the name of Reed that joined up over around Rochester, and he wrote some very detailed letters. And but he comments about Breckenridge's occupation of Rochester. Rochester being in Butler County, we've got what we refer to as Rochester Dam. A lot of people have heard of that, Rochester Dam. And John Prine refers to it. He kind of made that one of the household terms for Muhlenberg County. You got Muhlenberg County and Paradise and Rochester Dam. But Rochester Dam it doesn't touch Butler County. Rochester is in Butler County, but Rochester Dam runs between Muhlenberg County and Ohio County. So it's an interesting situation. Breckenridge, I didn't mean to digress, but Breckenridge occupied the area of Rochester during that period, and he did some pretty heavily set troop movements throughout the county.
Well, you talk about the being a line dividing the state. If there was a line, it was a line drawn by a toddler and then traced by another toddler, and it did not. It was not clear.
The lines, sometimes they were inside a house. Where's the line? Dad against son, brother against brother. That term almost becomes it's overused, brother against brother. But let's think for a minute. It's very true. Not everybody saw eye to eye. Whatever their reasoning was, there were great divisions in houses and neighbors, and the stories of out and out fist fights in the old dirt road out in front of the houses where they didn't agree on it. And
Yeah.
sadly, if you read about the people that were at odds with each other, most of them didn't own slaves. They just chose a side,
Yeah.
for whatever reason. Seemed like
Yeah.
the right
Yeah.
thing to do, I suppose.
Yeah. Now, we had an episode a while back about Sacramento,
Yes.
and all that, but we can touch on it a little bit, because it's a pretty interesting battle. We had Derek Lindo come on and talk about the Battle of Sacramento, but let give us the gist of it, I guess.
Well, there's a few things that my book will point out that is often overlooked. Keeping in mind that Sacramento is in McLean County, and McLean County was actually enlarged mostly Muhlenberg County until 1850 something, not long before the war. And when I count these soldiers, let's talk about that. A lot of them were born over around Calhoun or Sacramento and stuff, but their place of birth is always given as Muhlenberg County because none of the soldiers were born in there. There were no soldiers born in McLean County. They would have had to be between 6 and 10 years old during the war to have fought if
Yeah.
they were in McLean County. So, just for clarification, Sacramento is very significant to Muhlenberg history because Nathan Bedford Forrest had ties to Muhlenberg County. One of his first scout that he took with him was a man by the name of Colonel Robert Maxwell Martin, and locally we just call him Bob Martin or Colonel Bob Martin. He was born on the Rumsey Road, about where currently we have a place called the Muhlenberg County Opportunity Center, where it's really a nice place where they sell goods and wares and give people the chance to work that couldn't find work otherwise. It's really a great facility. On that hillside, before that would have been the county poor farm, and before that it was the home of the Martins, where Robert Martin lived. Robert was a clerk at the time when the war broke out, really didn't have any aspirations to be that involved, and he had some training and quite knowledgeable. But anyhow, he takes up with Nathan Bedford Forrest. And Forrest and he hit it off very well because neither one of them knew any fear. They knew no danger. Took a lot of chances. And the night before the battle, there had been a skirmish in South Carrollton, also in Muhlenberg County, the day before. And then several soldiers moved into this area over there, which is right on the cusp of the Martin Farm on the Rumsey Road. And Forrest was actually in Hopkinsville, and he brought his unit. Let's see, I forgot the number of men here. Well, anyhow, he brought him up from Hopkinsville, and his path he traveled. He spent the night in a place called Sisting, and I like to talk about that place because today we call it Rosewood, one of the most beautiful communities in the south part of the county. They spent the night down there. Early in the morning, they rode into the county seat, resupplied, rode out, and met Robert Martin, who knew the area very well. By then, Martin had also assisted in the recruitment of Adam Stovepipe Johnson. And Johnson was he's probably historically better noted than Martin, but Forrest actually made the comment when Stovepipe Johnson was first introduced to Colonel Forrest. He said, I'll take you on, but can you compare with my man Martin here? And Martin vouched for him. He said, bring him. He can do the work. I know who he is. I know what he can do. And so at the point of the battle, he had two very qualified scouts to carry him to Sacramento. But Forrest, that was his first fight. It was his first battle. And he was very overzealous, if you ask me. He did well at the battle. But as they moved down the Rumsey Road towards Sacramento, it got faster and faster, and I don't know. There was a whole lot of hand-to-hand combat. They engaged with the 3rd Kentucky Cavalry Union, which was at Garce Pond, and a lot of the soldiers that were wounded and killed, and some of them mortally wounded that day, were Muhlenberg County soldiers. In my research, I was able to identify another Muhlenberg County soldier killed on that day that hadn't been documented, which I was very excited to find that. A piece of Muhlenberg history that really comes out for me here, and we've discussed this. I don't know with the guy that has there's a belt plate on the back of it. It says A. Bacon, and this is one of the stories that I love to tell. On the day of the battle, there was a commander, Captain Albert G. Bacon, of the 3rd Kentucky Cavalry Union, and he was, I think, the last man that engaged with hand-to-hand with Forrest himself, Nathan Bedford Forrest. And as the two engaged, Forrest took one of the men out with his saber and shot the second. There was 2 men, and one of them was Bacon. When Bacon hit the ground, he wasn't dead. He was from up around Bardstown, I think, is what my notes have here, I think. Anyhow, and as he lay there on the ground dying, people still had sentiments for the human person. You know, you could read all about hand-to-hand combat. Oh, yeah, it sounds really wild and crazy, but to look a man in the eye and pull the trigger, it's a whole lot bigger story.
Yeah.
Well, the battle was over, and Bacon's laying on the ground, and one of the guys that was standing that had been there fighting along beside Forrest was a man by the name of D.W. Johnston. And Johnston climbs off of his mount as well as Forrest, and they're down there, they're talking to Bacon, and he said, "I'm Albert G. Bacon, 3rd Kentucky Cavalry," and, you know, however he announced it, "I'm sure to die on this day." Well, they wrap him up in a blanket and carry him to a farmhouse where he can somewhat die in comfort or peace, somewhere where they're close by. But Bacon says, "I got a wife and family, and they're back, you know, home. Will you take these things for me?" Is the way it's described. I found this at a newspaper article from Owensboro, Kentucky. And D.W. Johnston says, so I proceeded to take the items that Bacon had offered, his belt, his saber, his sheath, all of his stuff. Of course, I'm sure they used most of that in combat, but among that would have been his belt plate. Interestingly enough, on the back of that belt plate, he had scratched A. Bacon. About 3 years later, under the command of Robert Maxwell Martin, there was an engagement called Coal Bank over near Greenville, just a couple of miles out. I think it was 1863. So 2 years, 3 years, whatever.
Yeah.
Apparently that belt plate got dropped, and it was refound by a friend of mine, historian, a half a dozen years ago. He pulls it out of the dirt, and he can still read A. Bacon on the back of it. Now, when I first learned about the belt plate, I had never seen the piece written by D.W. Johnston, but when I found it, I was jumping off my chair about 3 feet. Because how could a dead man's buckle end up, 15 miles down the road somewhere at another battle? But it was fully explained. And to find a piece of history like that and make that connection, make a loop, I mean, a very exciting piece to identify. But that's my story about Sacramento.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Muhlenberg had a lot of representation there. It was, and Martin was the reason he took them in that direction, because he knew the route well. The Muhlenberg County boy.
Now, I'm going to be honest here. I wrote on my notes, "Kids will play pranks," and I have forgotten what I meant by that. I'm assuming there was some sort of mischievous stuff that had happened. Well, do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I can tell you. Well, keeping in mind, as we talked about how news traveled during the war, and how people they were like on pins and needles all the time. And when you get a bunch of 12 to 20 or 19 or 20-year-old boys together, they come up with great ideas. Well, they knew that the people in Muhlenberg County had seen, like we've just discussed with Breckenridge's pass through, when Buckner brought his soldiers through, all these presents, Nathan Bedford Forrest, they were all nervous. There was going to be they thought there would be a great battle fought in Muhlenberg County. That was the anticipation. When they geared up down at South Carrollton and built all the breastworks, that was the Union Army was fully prepared for a huge engagement. Well, it turns out that was later became what we know as the Battle of Fort Donelson, which occurred, in that area of Tennessee. But kids knew that they were the townspeople or locals were really nervous about seeing all these soldiers moving. And when Buckner came through Muhlenberg, he was pulling some cannon. He had some artillery pieces with him, and they thought it'd be great if we had one of those. And so there was a young man by the name of Edward O. Pace out in the Bancroft area, and Buckner had spent the night there. And shortly after Buckner had moved on, they approached this blacksmith and they said, "Can you make us a cannon?" So they sat down and sketched out the plans to make a homemade cannon, not for war purposes, just to scare people. So Pace said, let's go get a big tree, good hardwood tree, and we'll cut a section of that tree out. And he said, "I'll band it." And what he did is he took iron banding like you would on I'm assuming like a wagon wheel, or maybe not that heavy a gauge. It may have been more like what you would find on like a whiskey barrel or some type of keg, but he put continuous bands around it to reinforce it, to make it stronger. And he had a big auger, like a 2.5, 3-inch bit that he drilled, halfway or better than it. So more or less, he had built them a mortar type cannon, and it wouldn't be good for fighting, but reenactors know very good and well that you can take that barrel now and you can pack it with black powder and put a niter hole in it and set that powder off, and it'll make thunder. With a little bit of packing, it'll make a lot of thunder. So they worked and worked. They put this gun together out there around Bancroft, and one night, about the time they assumed everybody was in for the night, of course, anybody that understands country living, and especially in that day, it was quiet. And they fired, and they could hear it for miles and miles. It became the calm. They just knew that the war was on, battle was taking place, people hiding out or pouring out into the streets discussing, where is it at? Where are they fighting? Well, it came from over there. Maybe it's down there. It got to be a big deal. But they blasted it. They said it was loud as thunder. It's not a cloud in the sky. It scared everybody half to death. That was some good pranks. And there were some others too, but that one comes to mind. That was one of the fun moments I think that they had during the taking advantage of people's fears, right? Boys will be.
Oh, yep. It never senses to fail. It's going to happen. So the Mexican-American War was really I guess when you're looking at the United States history, that was probably about the closest to the Civil War, I guess. And go ahead.
Time-wise, the leaders that you have fighting in the Civil War were mostly West Pointers. Unless you were in the Confederate Army, they were still mostly West Pointers, but you had a lot of partisan Rangers. And the West Pointers that we're talking about, it's amazing the number of generals and some of the lesser officers, but they'd come up together. They'd fought during the Mexican War. Most of them together. If we could name them: Hood, Grant, Buell and Buckner. We've talked about Buell and Buckner, both generals that spent some time in Muhlenberg County. And it's crazy. I've seen photos like in Harper's weekly journal, I think it is. It's the old publication with these very ornate photographs of the officers from the state of Kentucky. And if you check into them a little bit further, you'll find most of them came up and fought together side by side during the Mexican War. Like I said, Bill and Buckner both did, and we could just name them. But yeah, they go closely together. We actually had a interesting soldier from Muhlenberg County. His name was Thomas Sumner, and he's the only one that I found that drew a pension from 3 wars of that century. He drew a pension from the War of 1812, the Mexican War, and he filed for a pension as a Union soldier. I don't know if he was successful in drawing anything because he lied about his age. He was very old, very young in the War of 1812, very old in the Civil War. But I thought it was unique that he was in all 3 of those conflicts. And but they figured him out too quick. He wasn't gone with his regiment very long in the Civil War, even though he told them he was 50 years old, and I think he was, I don't know, 70. They could see in his actions that he wasn't capable of doing the work of an infantry. He couldn't march, or cavalry. I don't have his unit in front of me, but they realized he was older and they sent him home. But yeah, there were a lot of veteran soldiers and officers of the Mexican War that were involved in the Civil War.
Well, he tried his best. He tried his best to keep fighting, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, he believed in what he was doing, so can't fault him for that.
Yeah. The tree where General Albert Sidney Johnston fell. Is that in?
That's the Battle of Shiloh, actually. During April of 1862, they were fighting at Shiloh. Albert Sidney Johnston, he actually was shot, if I remember right, behind the knee, and his boot quickly filled with blood. Got down off of his horse and sat down, and they were trying to get him medical help, and he refused it. He wanted his medical staff to tend to the soldiers, the boys that was fighting under him, and I think in a matter of minutes he was dead. I haven't been there in 20 years or so. I assume the old tree is still there. For years, the tree was gone, and it was just a stump when I saw it. It wasn't a tree, stump, and they cut it off and shrouded the top of it to protect it and treated it heavily for insects and weather and stuff, and had it in cage there. But I saw it. I was able to see that at one time. You could go up to the tree. You could actually touch it at the time. I don't know. I assume it's still there, but I spent a lot of time as a young person. I took every minute that I could away from, if I wasn't at work or had other obligations, we'd load up and go somewhere. And where are we going? They could assume we were going to a cemetery or a battlefield, probably. And but yeah, that was a cool place to visit. Shiloh is a beautiful place. There was one point where Muhlenberg soldiers of the 9th Kentucky Confederate Army that we talked about was on opposing sides from Union soldiers in the 11th Kentucky, and they were all, here we go, brother against brother or friend against friend, and they recognized each other across the battlefield.
Wow.
And I think some of the 11th Kentucky took a couple of fellas down there, one or two, but that were friends of theirs, took them prisoners, I don't know how you handle that, you grew up together, but hey, today you're going with me.
That's a hard situation to think about. What would you do? We're going to pause our discussion right here with Barry Duvall. Again, thank you, Barry, for coming on. We will continue next week talking about some more of Muhlenberg County and the Civil War. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you. The viewers, the listeners, we want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.